Cocky soldier swung at her in the bar. She was his combat instructor's sweetheart. Why don't you slide down the bar and let the real soldiers have their space? The words cut through O'Sullivan's taproom like a blade scraping the flat of a knife across concrete. Slow, deliberate, designed to draw blood without breaking skin. Staff Sergeant Marcus Holt delivered them with the kind of smile that expected applause. He got it. 3 men to his left erupted in laughter. 2 more joined from behind. 6 soldiers, fresh off a brutal 5-day field rotation at Fort Benning's combat course, looking for someone to be bigger than. They had found her. She was sitting at the far end of the bar, alone, a glass of water in front of her, barely touched. 32 years old, though most people who looked at her guessed younger. Her hair was pulled back in a regulation bun so precise it looked machine-done. She wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a plain charcoal jacket zipped to the collar, with absolutely nothing on her that announced rank, unit, or affiliation. She was small, objectively, 5'4" in boots. The kind of frame that made men like Holt feel generous for even noticing her. Her hands were wrapped around the water glass with a grip that was calm, deliberate, and completely still. She had not looked up. 43 people occupied O'Sullivan's that Friday evening. Off-duty soldiers, a cluster of contractors from the base administrative office, a pair of civilian engineers who had been attached to the training rotation, and the bar staff. 4 people who had seen this dynamic play out before and had already stopped pretending to wipe down glasses. 43 people, all watching Marcus Holt finish a story he'd started before she walked in and was now making her the punchline of. Holt was 26, 6'2", broad across the shoulders in the way that military conditioning produces, not gym-built vanity muscle. Actual functional mass from carrying 70-pound rucks across terrain that breaks most people by noon. He had completed Ranger School 8 months ago. He wore the tab with the quiet arrogance of someone who believed it was the finish line rather than the starting pistol. His chest didn't have ribbons yet. It had potential, and he knew it, and he made sure everyone in his vicinity knew he knew it. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, weight shifted back, the posture of a man who had never once needed to worry about what happened next. She still hadn't looked up. At the other end of the bar, set slightly apart from a group of off-duty NCOs in civilian dress, Master Sergeant Raymond Cole sat with a glass of bourbon he had been nursing for 40 minutes. He was 61. He had 33 years in service. He had done 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, a classified rotation that he still did not discuss in rooms with fewer than 4 stars present, and he had spent the last 4 years as a senior evaluator at the Army's Combat Training Center. He had a way of sitting very still that people who didn't know him read as relaxed. People who did know him understood it as the opposite. His eyes had moved to the woman at the bar the moment Holt opened his mouth. They had not moved away. Something about her. He couldn't place it. But it was there, filing itself quietly into the part of his brain that had never stopped working, the part that had kept him alive through situations where louder men were not. Holt moved down the bar. His boots clicked on the hardwood. Not hurrying. Savoring, "I'm serious," he said, pulling up next to her stool and leaning on the bar like he owned it. This section's sort of informally reserved. You understand? Nothing personal. He looked back at his unit, the kind of look that invites everyone else to join in. 3 of them obliged. The laughter was the easy, uncomplicated kind. The kind that felt like a given. She set her water glass down, centered it on the coaster. Her movements were the kind of precise that didn't look like effort. It looked like habit so deep it had become anatomy. She looked up at him for the first time. "I'll move," she said, "when I'm finished." 8 words. No anger, no apology. She picked the glass back up and returned to facing the bar. Holt blinked. His jaw tightened for one beat, just a flicker, then he recovered and turned it into a grin. Finished with what? Your water? He spread his hands for the crowd. She's guarding a water glass, fellas. The laughter came louder this time. One of his unit, a specialist named Drucker, made a mock-concerned face, stage whispering that maybe she needed backup, which produced the kind of group laughter that makes everyone present choose sides without realizing they're doing it. Cole's pen. He'd had it out, marking something in a small notebook he carried everywhere, an old habit from evaluation work. Stopped moving. She had not reacted. Not to Drucker, not to the laughter. Her breathing was controlled. 4 counts in, hold 4, 4 counts out, hold 4. Her spine was perfectly vertical. Her hands on the glass were not white-knuckled, not shaking, not gripping harder than necessary. She was still, in the way that a very deep lake is still, calm all the way to the bottom, and therefore impossible to read from the surface. That stillness. Cole had only seen it in 2 categories of people in 33 years. Trained hostage negotiators, and operators whose classification level meant their personnel files required separate authorization to open. He looked at her hands. The jacket covered most of them, but when she set the glass down, her right sleeve rode up a 1/4 inch. He saw the edge of something at her wrist. Dark ink. Military geometry. He couldn't make out the design from here, but the placement, inner wrist, low, the kind of location a long sleeve or watch strap would keep hidden, was not the placement of decorative ink. He looked back at his bourbon. His jaw was very slightly tight. Something about this woman. The story spread the way these things do in a closed community. Fast, embellished by each telling, wearing the shape of whatever the teller needed it to be. By 2100 hours, the version circulating through the barracks had Holt telling her off entirely. Her leaving the bar in embarrassment. The unit celebrating like men who had earned something. The actual version, that she had said 8 words and not moved, didn't travel as well. Stories require clear winners. The crowd had decided who won before the verdict was in. She stayed at the bar for another 40 minutes after Holt and his unit moved to a booth. Alone, water untouched, past the halfway mark. She was filing patterns the same way she always did when inserted into a new environment. Who deferred to whom? Which NCOs looked to which senior NCO before speaking, where the informal authority lived beneath the official rank structure. O'Sullivan's on a Friday post-rotation was a data environment. She was reading it the way she had been trained to read operational terrain. The barracks of Fort Benning's Advanced Combat Training Facility ran 312 personnel through a brutal 8-week combined arms course each rotation. It was not the gentlest assignment in the Army's inventory. The instructors were chosen for technical excellence and the kind of interpersonal calibration that kept people functional under extreme stress without letting them break entirely. The curriculum included close quarters battle, land navigation under degraded conditions, weapons qualification across 14 platforms, and a final evaluation week that most trainees described afterward with a 100-yard stare and a long exhale. The new rotations cadre assignments had been posted that morning. Most of the trainees had read them. Some had not. Marcus Holt had not. By 2200, he was back at the bar. Different energy now, looser, the bourbon showing in the slight looseness at his jaw, the way his gestures had picked up extra radius. Drucker and 2 others were with him. They had apparently made a joke about her on the way back from the booth, and Holt had decided the joke was better delivered in person. He settled back onto the stool beside her, with the comfortable authority of a man who expected the room to arrange itself around him. Still here, he observed. Still here, she agreed. You know, he said, turning toward her with the deliberate, theatrical patience of someone who had practiced this, I've been thinking about why someone like you would be in a place like this on a night like this. He gestured at the bar, the soldiers, the general environment. And I can't figure it out. You don't look like you belong here, no offense. She looked at him, not up from a task this time. Directly leveled the kind of look that had a weight to it that didn't match her size. None taken, she said. So what is it? He leaned an elbow on the bar. Family on base? Civilian contract? You're not a soldier. I'm exactly what my credentials say I am, she said. And what's that? You'll find out Monday morning, she said, and looked back at her glass. Something moved across Holt's face, not quite confusion, not quite irritation, but something that occupied the space between them. His friends exchanged a look. Drucker made a face that suggested she was more trouble than she was worth. Holt recovered with the speed of someone for whom recovery was an automatic social reflex. Monday morning, he repeated, with a short laugh. Right, he turned back to his friends. Whatever, not worth it. He had already moved on in his head. He had already filed her under irrelevant and locked the drawer. He did not notice, in the moment before she looked back at her glass, that Master Sergeant Cole across the bar had caught her eye. A fraction of a second. Nothing in her face changed. But Cole had set down his bourbon very carefully and looked at the ceiling. The expression of a man running a calculation he had not expected to need to run. Cole's pen had been motionless for 20 minutes. The bar emptied by 23:30. She was one of the last to leave. She paid in cash, tipped exactly 18% to the dollar, and walked out the side door into the Georgia night, without looking back. Cole watched her go. He had been a senior evaluator at the Combat Training Center for 4 years. Before that, 2 decades of operational work in theaters that did not make it into briefings that were not themselves classified. He had worked with people who operated at classification levels that made his own look like a guest badge. He had met 3 of them in his career in circumstances where their cover had been intact. Every one of them had the same particular stillness, not stillness like rest, stillness like loaded. He stood, left his bourbon on the bar, still a third full, which he never did, and walked outside into the parking lot. The Georgia night was warm, humid, smelling of cut grass and diesel from the motor pool 2 blocks east. He stood at the edge of the lot for a moment. Her sleeve, the ink at her wrist, the geometry of it. He had been trying to place it since he first saw it, and it had finally landed. He had seen that insignia exactly once before. 7 years ago. In a briefing room at the Pentagon that required 2-factor biometric clearance to enter. On a slide that had been classified above the level of everyone in the room except the 3-star who was running the briefing, it had been described in that briefing as the operational mark of a unit that did not officially exist. A unit whose members, as of that briefing, had between them accumulated a classified record that the 3-star had said, without drama, represented the most concentrated individual combat effectiveness in the history of the United States military. He stood in the parking lot for a long time. He thought about Marcus Holt sitting beside her at that bar, loose with bourbon and the certainty that came from 8 months of wearing a Ranger tab, telling her to move, calling her sweetheart. God help him, Cole thought. God help him come Monday morning. Monday came the way Monday always came at Fort Benning at 0500, with the PA system running formation calls across the training area and the smell of coffee and cordite already threading through the barracks corridors. 312 trainees, the new rotation, assembled in their unit formations on the central parade ground by 0530. The instructors stood at the front, facing them, cadre sheets in hand. The administrative sergeant called roll. Personnel acknowledgement. The cadre list was read. Holt was in the second row of his training platoon when the combat instructor assignments were announced. He was listening with the half-attention of someone who had done this enough to know which parts mattered and which parts were administrative scaffolding. Unit assignments, equipment assignments, safety briefings. Then the cadre listings. Platoon 2. Primary combat instructor. Direct report to CTC senior evaluator. Instructor designation. Actual. And then a name. He heard it. His brain registered it. And then something happened in the sequence between hearing and understanding that felt like a gear catching wrong, a brief mechanical stutter where nothing turned the way it was supposed to. Because he knew that name. He had read it the previous week in a brief on the rotation's cadre structure. The brief he had skimmed because he had assumed it was administrative scaffolding. But he knew that name from somewhere else, too. From the kind of somewhere else that didn't announce itself. And then he saw her, walking from the cadre line to the front of the formation. Plain uniform. No decoration visible. Regulation bun. She moved with the unhurried precision of someone for whom moving through a formation of 300 people was operationally unremarkable. She took her position at the front of Platoon 2 and turned to face them. She looked directly at Holt. He felt the blood drain from his face somewhere around the third second. "Good morning," she said to the platoon. Her voice was the same voice, calm, even, the kind of tone that did not require volume because it already had everything else. "I'll introduce myself properly during the first evaluation block. For now, what you need to know is that I have the authority to fail any one of you at any point in this rotation for cause, to recommend immediate program removal, and to flag any conduct issues directly to the Combat Training Center commander without going through the standard chain. My evaluations are unappealable. My cadre authority supersedes any other instructor present." She paused, precisely 2 seconds. Questions? No one spoke. She looked at the Platoon 2 ENSO. "Begin the block." She controlled her breathing. 4 counts in, hold 4. 4 counts out, hold 4. Cole was standing 50 meters back, watching from the edge of the training ground. His pen was in his hand. His notebook was closed. He had not written anything yet. He was watching Marcus Holt's face with the focused attention of a man cataloging something important. Holt's jaw was locked. His face had gone through surprise and was cycling through something that had not yet resolved into either humility or its opposite. His hands were at his sides, still not at ease, at stillness, which was different. His ranger training was the only thing keeping his posture regulation when everything else in his body wanted to do something else entirely. She had walked past him on her way to the equipment bay and had not broken stride. Cole made a note. The first evaluation block ran 3 hours. She ran it with the precise authority of someone for whom authority was not a costume. She knew the platform specifications for every weapon in the bay without looking at the reference sheet. When Specialist Drucker, who had apparently not learned anything from Friday night, made a comment under his breath to the man beside him during her safety brief, she stopped mid-sentence, looked at him, and waited. 5 seconds of silence. "Specialist Drucker," she said, "the M110 SAS has a maximum effective range of how many meters against point targets?" Drucker looked at the rifle in the rack. 800, Instructor. "The barrel length?" He paused. 20 inches, Instructor, the suppressor attachment system used by the variant issued to this facility." He said nothing. She waited for exactly 4 seconds. "When you have the answer, Let me know. The rest of you. She turned back to the group. The suppressor attachment system is a Gemtech halo. You will know this for the evaluation. Because not knowing something in the field means someone else does not come home. She moved on. Cole had watched the whole thing from the observation window of the administration office. He had not moved. His pen had stopped. He knew the M110 suppressor variant she had referenced. It was not the standard training facility inventory. It was the variant issued to units whose requisition forms were processed through channels that most supply sergeants had never seen. He knew this because he had processed one such form, once in a previous life. He looked down at his notebook. He had written 2 words. Who sent her? By Wednesday, the training rotation had developed the kind of collective understanding that groups develop when they're paying attention. Not spoken, not formalized, just present in the way people moved around her. The questions they asked, the ones they didn't. Holt had not spoken to her outside of required instructor-trainee interactions. He had been correct, to instruction, in every observable way. But something was building in him that his correctness was failing to contain. On Wednesday afternoon, in the equipment bay, she was supervising a weapons maintenance block. Trainees were broken down into pairs, field stripping and reassembling rifles under time. Holt was working through the disassembly of a M4 carbine with a specialist named Tran when she came to stand behind them, observing. She watched for 30 seconds. Your bolt carrier group sequencing is off, she said to Holt. You're returning the firing pin before the bolt. That sequence works fine on a clean system. On a fouled system in a high-stress situation, you'll lose approximately 2.3 seconds at the worst possible moment. Holt said nothing. He corrected the sequence. Again, she said. He disassembled. Reassembled again. He did it again. She watched the 3rd repetition. Your hands know what to do, she said, almost to herself. Let them do it. She moved to the next station. Tran looked at Holt. Holt kept his eyes on the rifle. That evening, in the barracks, Drucker made the mistake of saying out loud what the platoon had been thinking privately. That maybe Holt should say something, do something, that it wasn't right that she was running them like they were recruits. That someone with a Ranger tab shouldn't have to take this from a woman who hadn't even announced her record. Holt looked at him for a long time. Then, he said, "Keep your mouth shut," and went back to his bunk. Drucker blinked. That was not the response he had expected. Cole, if he had been there, would have noted it. Thursday brought the force-on-force evaluation. 2 platoons, opposing forces, live-fire scenario simulation with marking rounds. Full kit. 8 hours in Georgia terrain that had been precisely selected for its ability to produce every physical and cognitive challenge the standard curriculum demanded. She ran the evaluation from the observer position, not in the field, but moving between checkpoints with the fluency of someone who had done this not as an instructor, but as a participant, and not in simulations. At checkpoint 4, a ravine crossing with a steep approach grade, one of the trainees, Private First Class Osai, youngest in the platoon, went down with a twisted ankle on the descent. Not serious, but in a real scenario, a non-trivial liability. She reached him at the same time as the platoon medic. She crouched, assessed, gave the medic a 2-word instruction on the rap method that the medic executed immediately without questioning, the kind of deference that is not taught, only given. Holt, who had been covering the ravine exit, watched from 40 meters. He watched the way she crouched, the way her left hand braced on the terrain, not for balance, but for positioning. Like someone who had crouched in terrain like this countless times and had a specific, learned relationship with how her body occupied uncertain ground. He watched the way she scanned the ridgeline above them while talking to Osai, never fully pulling her attention from the larger environment, even in a task that required focus. He had been in ranger school. He had trained with some of the best people in the Army's inventory. He had never seen someone move through a threat environment like that. Not like it was a performance of training, like it was a language they had been speaking since before he was born. He thought about the bar. Her, sitting there. Her 8 words. When I'm finished. His mouth went dry. Friday. 0900. The cadre administration office. She had filed her midweek evaluation reports the previous evening. 3 trainees flagged for performance issues. 1, Drucker, flagged for a conduct note that would remain in his file. She was reviewing the notes on the final evaluation block parameters when the knock came at the office door. Holt, in uniform. Regulation. He stood in the doorway with the exact posture of someone who had rehearsed this and was now unsure whether the rehearsal had been adequate. Permission to speak, Instructor. She looked up from the evaluation sheet. Granted. He came to parade rest. Not casual. Deliberate, Instructor. I want to formally acknowledge that my conduct on Friday evening at O'Sullivan's was inappropriate, disrespectful, and inconsistent with the standards I'm expected to hold. He said it with the clean delivery of someone who had written it out and memorized it. No hedging, no qualification, no but. She looked at him for a moment. The look had no heat in it, no performance of forgiveness, no withholding of it, just the level assessment of someone taking an accurate reading. Noted, she said. A beat. He had expected something more. He waited. Is there something else, Staff Sergeant? He hesitated. Then, permission to ask a question, Instructor. Granted, your record. He said it carefully. We were briefed on your credentials, but the specifics are above the briefing level. He met her eyes. I'd like to understand who I was talking to on Friday. Something shifted in the room, not in her expression, in the quality of the silence around it. She set down her pen. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she pushed her sleeve up to her left forearm and set it on the desk facing him. The tattoo covered the inner forearm from 2 inches above the wrist to the middle of the forearm. The design was geometric, precise, a heraldic construction in dark ink. At its center was a blade, vertical, flanked by 2 angular wings that folded at a specific angle he did not recognize from any unit insignia he had ever seen. Around the blade's hilt, in lettering small enough to require leaning close, were 6 letters. He leaned close. He read them. He went rigid. He had heard that designation. Once, in a training environment, a senior NCO had mentioned it in passing, the way veterans sometimes let a classified reference slip when they're off duty and comfortable, then go immediately quiet when they realize they've said it. The senior NCO had not explained it. He had simply said, "Those are the people you never see coming." And then he had changed the subject. "Instructor," Holt said. His voice had dropped without his choosing to drop it. She pulled her sleeve back down. She picked up her pen. "Carry on, Staff Sergeant." He stood there for 2 more seconds. Then he came to attention, clean, sharp, full formal, and held it. It was not the gesture of a man following a regulation. It was the gesture of a man choosing to do something he understood the weight of. She looked up at him from the evaluation sheet. "Dismissed," she said, quietly. Cole was in the hallway when Holt came out of the office. He had not been listening at the door. He had been walking past on his way to the senior cadre meeting, and the timing was incidental. He watched Holt's face as the younger man walked past him. He had seen that face before, Not often. On men who had gone into a situation with one understanding of the world and come out of it with a fundamentally different one. The expression was not quite humility and not quite awe. It was something that lived between them, the specific look of a person recalibrating at a cellular level. Cole continued to the senior cadre meeting room and took his seat. The CTC commander, Brigadier General Harris, was already present. The meeting was a standard rotation progress briefing. It proceeded through 3 agenda items before Harris set down his papers and looked at Cole. Master Sergeant, you've been on this rotation since Monday. Your evaluator's assessment of the cadre performance? Cole considered the question for exactly the amount of time it required. I have one observation, sir. Go ahead. The primary combat instructor for Platoon 2. Cole looked at his notebook. Then, he set it face down on the table. What he was about to say was not from the notebook. I've been in this work for 33 years, sir. I've evaluated instructors, operators, and the people who evaluate them. I have once before, in my career, been in the same room as someone with her operational classification. He paused. I would recommend that anyone in this building, anyone in this rotation who has not already updated their understanding of who they're dealing with, do so immediately. Sir, Harris looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, that's consistent with what I've been told, the general said. Cole picked up his notebook and did not write anything else. That afternoon, 1400 hours, the cadre bulletin was updated. Standard administrative communication. But attached to it, authorized by General Harris, was a memo that went to every active cadre member and the senior trainees in each platoon. It detailed, in the language of official military communication, the designation and authority level of the Platoon 2 combat instructor. It named her rank. It named her operational classification, which required a separate form to acknowledge receipt of. It named one line of her record, a single line, that had been cleared for limited distribution. Holt read the memo standing in the corridor outside the platoon bay, his back against the concrete wall, his face doing a series of things he was not managing. Drucker read it beside him. Whatever residual comedy Drucker had been carrying since Friday night was gone. He stood very still, staring at the paper, with the expression of someone who has just realized they walked into a room they were not cleared for and had been there for a week. The mess hall at 1730 was the kind of quiet that has texture. 43 trainees and 8 cadre members eating in the specific silence of people who have recently updated their priors on something significant. Her tray was at a corner table. She ate the way she did everything, with the precise efficiency of someone for whom caloric intake was a functional requirement rather than an event. She did not look up. She did not perform awareness of the silence. But Cole, 2 tables away, watched the room. He watched the way the other cadre members carried themselves differently than they had on Monday. The senior NCOs, who had been, in the way of senior NCOs everywhere, lightly skeptical of any instructor they hadn't personally vetted, they were sitting differently now, eating differently, looking at her with the particular attention of people who are doing the math of their own proximity to excellence. The youngest of the cadre instructors, a sergeant first class named Morrow, who was 29 and good at his job, set his tray down across from Cole. That record, Morrow said quietly, with the delivery of someone stating something that felt too large to say normally. Yeah, Cole said. That single line they cleared for distribution. Yeah, how does someone... They don't, Cole said. Unless they're that. He picked up his coffee. Stop thinking about it. You'll sleep better. Morrow looked at her across the mess hall. He picked up his fork. He was quiet for the rest of the meal. Her watch read 20:47 when she walked out of the cadre administration building into the Thursday evening Georgia air. The The rotation had 3 weeks remaining. The evaluation schedule was set. Everything that needed to be in motion was in motion. The mission, the reason she was here, which had nothing to do with the training rotation and everything to do with a financial discrepancy in the base contracting records that linked to a network she had been tracking for 18 months, was on schedule. She stood on the steps for a moment. The sky at the western edge of the installation was pulling orange toward purple. The Georgia sunset doing what it always did at this hour, operating at full intensity without apology. Military time, 2051. The air smelled of cut grass and a distant hint of cordite from the afternoon's range work. She had been called many things. In this rotation, she had been called sweetheart, honey, someone who didn't belong. She had been called those things before, in other installations, other bars, other corridors, by men who had mistaken a plain uniform and a quiet manner for an absence of substance. They always thought the same thing, that the space she occupied was smaller than the space they occupied. They were wrong every time. She put her sleeve back down over the tattoo. She looked at the sky for a moment longer, mocked her rank, forgot she outranked every layer of their certainty. Justice isn't loud, it's patient. She went back inside. The contracting network had 2 primary nodes she had already mapped, and 3 she was still locating. One of them, the most careful, the most quiet, the one who had survived 6 previous investigations by staying 3 steps behind the visible line, was still operating somewhere inside the base's administrative structure. She had a partial signal, a pattern in the procurement records that repeated every 11 days. She had a surveillance image, pulled from a security camera in the contracting office parking lot, that showed someone at an angle that obscured everything useful. A partial silhouette. A vehicle she hadn't yet run. She sat back down at her desk. She opened her evaluation notes. She reviewed the 3 trainees flagged for the next day's block. Tomorrow would run the same as today. Efficient, unspectacular, invisible to everyone looking at the surface. The node was still out there. Careful, patient, operating on an 11-day cycle that she would break, eventually, the way she had broken everything else. Not with speed, not with noise, but with the particular, accumulated weight of paying attention when everyone else had decided there was nothing to see. She controlled her breathing. 4 counts in, hold 4, 4 counts out, hold 4. She went back to work. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to MVP Stories for more.